Brunenburg, autumn 914. Miles behind them battle began. A ridge before them afforded Osrith time and position to finally turn west, to see what she had left behind. The joke was on her now. She saw her shoulder. Was Aldhelm right? Had her brother borne her insults though she was in the wrong? Men have come with the Norse, from Irian, Eswe pointed out, and many black-haired warriors were amongst the men still heading east, in trudging, effortful lines towards, well, Osrith could believe of no other place they could be heading than Ead Spirig. Voices travelled over the ground. Osrith could pick up words she understood, not of Leinster nor Wild Munster, nor Connacht. These words were Gaelish, easily understandable by all of the Alba lords. Osrith looked along the line. Men from Ulster? Flansmen, or enemies who had sided with the Norse and had been expelled? We go on, Osrith told them all, we go east, and we go silent. I want you to hear everything you can. She said that to Phelim and Angus as we had already become silent, turning a little to the ribbon of slow-moving warriors. Over on the peninsula chaos ensued. Boats that had once contained Norse were ash. The fire was already licking the inner boundary of the fortification. Ethelfled, flanked by Aldhelm, surveyed the damage as her warriors burst forth. To find, not an army waiting to battle past the Mersons to Cester, but the tail end of warriors left behind to complete the foil. Irishmen, mainly, and some fair-haired Norse, in disparate groups thrusting forward and then pulling back. What are they doing? Asked Sihtric, looking at their opponents. Where are they all? Over there. Aldhelm told him, casting a long look up at the higher ground. It was obvious from their position that the incoming Norse had managed to get around Cester and the mighty Merson army. But there was one contingent of the army ready still to fight. As Ragnar Levason, the self-proclaimed Sea King, led most of his army on into Mercia, on the banks of the Merse stood one Dane who was always ready to fight any Saxons in his path. It was Hestin. What are you thinking? We asked Osrith, as they took a fork that led them away from the large army. If they went south, and then back round to the other side of the Ead Spirig fortress, there was less chance that Ragnar might think that they were any credible force. That if Ragnar can establish himself in Eofuic the Western Isles will be emptier, Osrith replied, in clear, articulate Gaelish. Then, she turned to the Mersons. Why does he come here? Ragnar Levason? Does anyone know? Because I seem to have been kept in the dark about nearly everything. It is said he has given up his Irish land and fate has granted him Britain, the whole island. It was Miral that spoke. Elfrith nodded too, and Osrith breathed in the cool mid-morning air. Why could no one have told her this yesterday? Given up? Osrith scoffed. Flansinna will have given him not a moment of peace, and nor shall we. Alfred's children have 6 of the 7 kingdoms, Cornwall, Wessex, Cent, East Anglia, Lindsey and Mercia. But Northumbria is out of their reach for now. When Norse flood east from Dublin, it is a war of attrition that Ethelfled and Edward need to play. They would do well to install a Norse king in Eofuic who is an ally to Mercia and Wessex. But Miral's face was inanimate, as was Elfrith's. I did not say Wessex ruled Mercia. I am not choosing my words well, old friends, she said, nodding to them, Elfkin and her other 3 Mercian warriors. I meant the 6 kingdoms, ruled by Edward and Ethelfled. Between them would do well to install an ally. No, that is not what I meant. Did you not know? Miral asked. Flansinna is dead. Dead? Osrith echoed, as they rode slower now, as if they were not warriors, but simpler folk, tradespeople perhaps, fleeing Cest at the sight of Norse. His son, Don Chada, is now High King, Elfrith told her. How do you know this? Osrith demanded, turning her horse about and facing them. Ethelfled. And then she knew. She knew all about why she was in that situation. Ethelfled must have told them to remain silent and keep as much from her as possible. Now they were far enough away to be able to tell their captain, Ethelfled. It was Elfrith who told Osrith, and we translated for the Alba warriors. She has regular intelligence from Atildoian. It is in her interest to know what her enemies are doing, and for many years her enemies are the Norse. Don Chada, Osrith thought, as she glanced at the lines of warriors, their pace quickening, their steps deliberate. They were going to Eadspirig. The fortress was their intended target, and Osrith recalled how he and Domhnall had plotted to overthrow Flann. She had overheard them when she climbed a tree at the monastery site of Armaka. So, Donchada Ui Neil had the throne now, and her mind drifted to Neil. What of little Neil? If she would go to Atilda Ian again, she would want to see little Grubbik Knees, a grown, kindly lord, protector of poor Gormelith, sister of Diffenwell, who had been much maligned by noblemen in her life. She hoped that Neil and Donchada were allies. I fear we are being more and more encroached upon, Miral told Osrith. Elfrith feels it more, if he does not mind my saying so. He glanced to his comrade, who nodded, permissively. Why must we give up our identity? We are not Wessex, nor ever shall be. They say we can't support ourselves and point to the Norse invasions as evidence. But could Wessex? We sent mercenaries to Ethandun. Wessex was not alone fighting the Danes. Alfred was not alone. Osrith turned, and began to lead the men again. I cannot tell you the answer, she told Miral, apart from mountains. Mountains? Welles has mountains, does it not, Owain? She looked across to the air to the Strathclydian throne, and repeated it in North Cymric. The young men nodded. Dulriata, Pitland, Strathclyde all have huge mountains. Mountains save kingdoms from invasions, and the indigenous hide in them and fight a slow, long war. Miral nodded in agreement. Down on the peninsula, the fight had become a skirmish. Danes taunted mercen troops, goading them to fight. Aldhelm shouted for prisoners. There will be no prisoners from us, Utad the Daneslayer, came Hestin's twisted, whiny voice. How is Hestin commanding the Norse, Lord? Asked Finan, but it was answered by Aldhelm when Sifik yelled the same question. He does not, Hestin replied, clearly relishing being the messenger to the clueless mercenaries. Ragnar Livusson, brother of your son-in-law, Utad, he has taken his men into Mercia. And the you were, with not a stitch of defense to cover your stupid little asses. So he was trying to sail inland hoping he would come across Eofuic. Utad shouted back. Does he not know of the Middle Mountains? He moved his horse further forward, so he was level with his one-time lover. Ethelfled looked at Utad, not moving her head. Why Eofuic, do you think? Asked Hengus, as Eadspirig loomed into view. They cannot get to Eofuic from the west in longboats. We have the Pennines, Miral pointed out, and smiled, realizing that there were some mountains in Mercia after all. They burned them, we pointed out. The Norse are going on foot. Osrith nodded her head. And, if Ragnar Livusson were to claim Eofuic, this meant, by default, he made claim to be king of the whole of Northumbria. Whigger, Osrith thought. He would never give up Bibbenberg. So if Ragnar did succeed, there would be a tiny chip of sandstone on which Ida's fortress stood, indominatable but isolated. It was why Ethelfled kept Utad to hand. Of course, a natural claimant to Bibbenberg as an ally would give her untrammeled claim. Alfred's dream of uniting the Anglish and Saxon kingdoms. And does that include your land? We asked. Beadily. My land? Osrith echoed, watching her brother's men claim prisoners far below them. Caeligulid, he clarified. Cumbraland. My family's homeland. St. Patrick's dwelling place. Your kingdom. Osrith was flattered for a moment, as she realized that was indeed true. But Constantine had ceded that land, and it was Strathclyde's now. Diffenwell's. It had been why he had conceived the plan when Domhnall had asked for it all those years ago at Glenorchy, before Domhnall's coronation at Dund. But Constantine had never once thought that Domhnall would send Osrith to marry Guthred. A scream come up, and another. Osrith slipped from her horse. From here, with the ever-moving line of Irish and Norse to their right, she could see into Cester. A figure had come through the western gate. A flash of auburn red hair in the sunlight told Osrith who it was who was tearing over the battlefield. Eadith. Osrith could see how the woman brought comfort to her brother, and satisfaction that Ethelfled was envious of her when she had appeared in the hall the evening before. It was clear she was running to Utad. But they were too far away to discern anything. Go on, or go back? Asked Elfkin, as Oshir, Falkberg and Elgfrith stood beside him. It is your decision, captain. The Albalords nodded in agreement. We go on, and do what we can at Yadispirig. For Mercia, she added, lowering her voice, hoping that the men would not raise a cheer for their homeland. Hint taken, and the foe traders were off again, onto a higher route towards the vulnerable fortress. 88,888,888 down on the Wyrolam Peninsula, and an argument was going on in Gaelish. And then, Finan stopped talking, much to Utad's relief, and started to piss on the warrior with whom he had argued with, and pushed to the ground. Later, Finan told Utad, as the Lord of Bibbenberg stood stunned as his best friend told him he had just killed his son, nephew. He shrugged. But he is here, Connell. But Utad would not find out about Connell until much later. Instead, he had more important matters to deal with, not least his one-time lover, who was standing beside Hestin. Brider. Utad had not seen her yet, nor seen Father Oswald. He would. He really would. The Uineal raped her? Utad asked Finan, who was recounting a tale, in pieces. Who? Ethan? But she was on a slaver. Had Finan known her before? In Ireland? He was. If the Ullaid, that was long ago, and she was the woman I loved more than anyone in the world, Finan told him bitterly, as they sat on the ground, anything that might have been called a battle over, the fire out. No. Not Ethan. Domhnall was her brother. In exchange for Donchada's support, he sold his sister into slavery, Finan told him, as weary men quit the field, and dead men lay in the mud. Ethan had to be cleared away for Flan Sinna to be High King. Marry the Gaelish Princess Muir, he sighed, the anticipated exertion of a battle now a weary burden. But you are late, Utad told Finan, as if he didn't know. Why were you so interested in what went on with your enemy? You are not interested in your enemy? Finan asked Utad, baldly. And then one day, my enemy brought 2 women to my father's land, as a peace bargain. Finan turned an ugly face to his friend while around them, men staggered away from the fight that had been no more than a skirmish. 2 princesses for 2 princes. Father agreed, and Flan Sinna became an ally for my father. For what? Finan declared. For what? Years of our kin dying, decomposing in the soil of Ullaid land. He broke off, and shook his head. So the Uineal took exception when I repudiated Gormlith and ran off with my lover. The slaver came to Strangford Lock. Connell. He, Finan broke off, finally unable to carry on. Perhaps if he had not seen his kin, perhaps if there had been enough of a fight for him to whet his blade and exorcise the ghosts of his mind. Gormlith, was that your wife, your Uineal wife? When Finan did not turn to look at him, Utad added, more gently, it sounds like a sad story. A sad story, Finan repeated. And then he turned to Utad, and cried, she was not wearing my coin. Your coin? Utad stared at him in bewilderment. Gormlith. Osrith. Finan hissed her name, and turned away again, playing with the hilt of Soul Stealer. Then, he turned his head slowly back to Utad. I have a son, we have a son. Lord knows, she has done what any mother would do, and put him out of danger. Osrith's child? But Finan did not answer, instead, gripped Utad on the arm. Lord, I swore to follow you, I swore to follow you for all my days. Do you know why? Utad didn't. But he figured, on this warfield prematurely evacuated, he was about to find out. I was in despair, 3 months since for his ship. I wanted to give up, I had nothing to live for. And then, he broke off, his eyes filling with the light of the sun overhead. You came aboard. You, from the land of the Cymric, of the blessed Saint Patrick. You, like a saint, like Colmcille himself, come to row with me, to give me hope again, to give me strength. And I thought, when I had run that bastard through, and I had my freedom once more, what else could I do than to serve you, Lord? He shook his head, and spoke to Utad as if his presence on the ship was divine intervention. Finan, laughed Utad, for there was nothing more that could be done at such a preposterous notion. I know you are a Christian, but, Lord, interrupted Finan, you may be pagan, but your family is not. Look, you even have Saint Oswald as kin, a most beloved saint, that even the mercenaries who killed him, pagan mercenaries, Penda himself, now revere him. Ha! So I am a saint now, Finan? Laughed Utad, and he turned to Citric, and called, Finan thinks I am a saint. Laughter grew, for what else could they do, battle deprived as they were. Saint Utad. Osbert, Finan said, softly. Saint Osbert. It has a nice ring to it. He sighed, and turned away. And we have a son. But it is true, she will not wait for me. Wait for you for what? Utad asked, leaning towards Finan. To get Bibbenberg, of course. Finan groaned. I promised her that when you took Bibbenberg, I would come for her. And she said she would wait. He shook his head. She had the coin, on a chain. It was twisted, having been hit by a blade in battle. Where was it? He demanded. She had the pearl jewel in her hair, as always. Who gave her that? Someone more dear to her than me. Perhaps the boy has it, Utad suggested, his heart softening to Finan after all he had heard. Yes, yes, Finan agreed. Perhaps Finan Beeg has it. Beeg? It means little, Finan told him. It's no wonder Gaelish is so hard to understand. Little Finan, she's called him. Finan pressed on. He will have the coin, to be sure. The only thing I brought with me from my homeland. I kept it safe, all those years, Utad, and now it belongs to my son. So she's put it round the neck of Constantine's child to pretend to you he's yours? Utad told him, darkly. Finan looked at Utad sharply, and then laughed. Ha ha. Finan's laugh punctuated the mid-morning air. You will have your joke, Lord. Next, you will say she has named him after me for that very reason. A hush was descending on the field now. Smoke drifted up from the northern section of Brunanburh Fort, as the last of its flames were blotted out from the channel of river water that had been diverted to it by some of Aldhelm's men. So, because I am a saint, you won't go to her, even when we have Bibbenberg? Utad asked him, understanding his friend for the first time in the 30 years they had known one another. And then that was all he said. For, staggering over the battlefield, through the dead and the dying, was Father Judas, his name snatched away from him by an angry father, no longer to be called by the family name. Utad's son. 88,888,888. Father Oswald, once Utad, the first son of Utad of Bibbenberg and Gisela Hearthknut's daughter, had brightened Osrith's evening the night before. A mere 5 minutes, and he had thrown his arms around his aunt, and brought her in from the cold and her endless watching so they could be reacquainted. He was delighted when Osrith told him he had a healthy cousin living in safety in Alba. He was also with news that there was a new bishop Eitcester, Leofstan. Is his wife of the name Gomer? Osrith asked Oswald, and his eyes lit up, and told her that she was right. So Osrith shared Gomer's other name, and her occupation, to her astounded nephew. No, Oswald told Osrith. No. He looked from the walls of his room, to the window and back to Osrith. Gomer? But she is. Yes, Osrith told him. No. He declared. Yes. Osrith had smiled. You marked my words. And where there was Sister Gomer there was gold, and Osrith would be in favor with Constantine if she brought it back. But treasure a question was for the future. Now, Osrith and her company had reached within 100 yards of the Adspirig fortress and its few yet determined guards. She was not to know what horror had unfolded for her nephew on the land below, away to the river, not feel, until much later, a true guilt for something she had done. Osrith had freed Brida. In doing so, she had freed a want of revenge stronger than any winter storm. And so, taking her vengeance out on Utad through his son, Brida had stormed. 88,888,888. Osrith had heard the name of a man named Sinalef, for Aldhelm had shared some brief, and clearly permitted, words with her on the ramparts of just before dawn. One of the words was of this Dane, whose company it was who was guarding Eadispirig. He was a mercen. You have met them before, Mormrengus ui Cambilaith of Strathclyde, Phelim ui Briddy of Pitland, Lord Eswi, Osrith had replied, listing the Alba warriors. Of Dull Rioter, Osrith, Eswi told her. Dull Rioter? Osrith did not know that, but she did know, now, that her friend Finolai, Abbot Findle was who he was now in Caerligwylid, was Eswi's brother along with Uunst, and therefore of Dol Riota too. But, while Aldhelm held the Mormers at Osrith's word, on the word of Ethelflaed's alliance, how was it he had chosen to trust a Dane, or at least a second-generation Dane, to be in charge of a guard-poor fortress, just when the Norse were trailing in its direction? Osrith's mind turned, in that grey light before dawn, to Saynid. "Keep your blade low, at an angle," she remembered him saying, and instinctively, she pulled Bué close to her, thinking, but not of the battle strategy. This Sinlef could wait. Would he be leading men now against Norse? Would he be tentatively guarding the border of Lothian, a place best to establish a border patrol, better to orientate the army to the ever-changing local politics? Constantine wanted at least to the wall, more if he could, and that meant, eventually, war with Bibbenberg. And she had thought of a plan. Elfkin slipped away. Osrith knew he was the fastest and least observable of them all, with the exception of Owen, who did not know the land. He was to alert the guard at the eastern gate of Cester and mobilize the mercenaries to the potential threat up at Yadisbirach. Meanwhile, Miral and Elfrith would make a big show of the Gales being there, making Ragnar see that the fortress's men were being added to under his nose. If he chose to attack then, it would be because it was better than there being even more mercenaries joining them. It would work. 88,888,888. It hadn't worked. Or rather, it might well have worked as a deterrent. Half of Mercia's army came at Elfkin's command, to flank, at least, the line of Norse, from inside the fortress. Osrith watched as the Norse made a detour around Eadspirrig and took the path that headed northeast. "We have a rearguard, now at least," Sinlef commented. "They are on their way to Eofuik." Aldhelm, who had led the mercenaries on Osrith's word, "and not here at all." "Not here because you came," Osrith told him. "We could never tell," Aldhelm reassured Osrith, clapping her on the shoulder. "You did well, Osrith. The Norse did not even attempt to raid here." Half armor. That was what she had used. Disguise the men on the ramparts in half their armor, the other half used strategically in between, and it had made it seem like they were double their number. Now he and Osrith were striding the battlements, Aldhelm smiling approvingly at her plan. "The Irish that have been pushed out, those who displeased New Uineal King, many allied sided with Norse to try to gain land. Regain land. Whatever war there was there, it had been going on for a long time. Did you find that out from the tail end of them, whoever were left behind?" Osrith asked, nodding towards the battle near the Brunanburh fortress. "I saw an execution," Aldhelm told her. "We were just turning away at that point. A few Norse, a few Dane leaders were laggarding by the burned ships." "Execution?" Below them, shouts of happiness could be heard through the fortress's wooden ceiling. The Mormers and the mercenaries were clearly celebrating. "A Dane. Hestin," Aldhelm told her, slowly. "The Prince Ethelstan was given the job." "By your brother." "By my brother," Osrith echoed in her mind. She looked back to the west, to the hammer-shaped spit of land called Wirelham that thrust itself in the direction of Dublin. Heston was a nasty piece of work, that was true. He had boarded the fishing boat that Gert had agreed Osrith use as passage to Hampton, to see Cutid in the first place. The man could be terrifying, but his luck had held all those years, until that day, until Ethelstan was shown the responsibility of execution. 43 enemy were executed. Afternoon came and Aldhelm thanked Osrith and her company for their timely intervention. Returning to Cester, Osrith told him, when he asked her what her next move was to be, "Perhaps the Lady Ethelflaed has some role for me." But more likely not, Osrith told herself as she rounded up her men. Well fed, she led them down Eadisbirrig Hill and to Cester, looking at the enemy heads, already on stakes at the riverside. Her brother's doing, no doubt. Beyond the river was the Northumbrian border, over which the tail end of Ragnall's company were trailing. "They are going that way," Elfrith told her, as they rounded the curve of the hill towards the city. "Into your kingdom." Osrith turned her head northwards, then glanced back at her friend, and saw that more warriors from Eadspirrig were joining Oshir and Eglfrith at the back of their group. "Not mine," Osrith replied. "Cumbraland is yours, if you chose to fight for it," Elfrith reminded her, and Miral, on the other side of her, smiled broadly. So that was it, Osrith thought. An idea that they might be restoring a queen to her land. Was it? She turned her head to see Owain smile at her too. He had all but said it could be her kingdom. When he inherited Dyfnwal's throne, we would agree, for all he was interested in was Bibbenberg. Now that was an amusing idea. It would irk Ethelfled, who, with Uhtred, was attempting to unite the Anglish and Saxons into one land, a separate Cymric kingdom. It could be done. There were mountains enough in Cumbraland's west, and Caerleigh was fortified enough to be its capital again. But Osrith knew could never hold it. Constantly it would be contested by Norse and Danes from Ireland, by Irene's people, too. And if Constantine or Owain were overthrown, her northern neighbour might decide to mount an invasion on behalf of Strathclyde to the ancient boundary of Montbridge. Should Uhtred regain Bibbenberg, he would never let her be. And what of the people that she imagined to be in a recreated Uhtred? They were not the people of her ancestors' time. Norse had come, Uhtred fragmented into Northumbrian rule, half claimed by Strathclyde. And if she had no people, whose interests she must protect, there was no point.